Name of God. Good morning, folks. It is 7:10 a.m. Now let's get back to our video on Rod of Iron News and NRI TV with the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. Let's take a look at that.
Like Christmas, birthdays, and New Year's all rolled into one. And the Viet Cong and the NVA, the North Vietnamese, had agreed there would be a ceasefire. And of course, they lied. They had long planned an offensive to take place early in 1968. The planning for it began in Hanoi back in 1967, and it continued all the way up literally till days before the attack. And unfortunately, we didn't pick up on the intelligence indicators that should have told us something much bigger than what's been going on in the past is about to happen.
January 31st, 1968 was the beginning of the Tet Offensive. We woke up in the morning with huge amounts of activity, noise, confusion. There was huge activity up around Hue, but nobody really knew what was going on.
It was business as usual, and all of a sudden, the sky opened up. It was raining in on our battery. That was supposed to have been a Lunar New Year's ceasefire. It wasn't. So the Tet Offensive came as a total surprise.
When dawn broke, a pilot and I took an O-1 small observation aircraft and came flying up east of the city, east of Hue, came up the Perfume River, which is behind us here, at a very low level, just to try and determine what was actually going on. When we came abreast of about where we were standing here right now, instead of the South Vietnamese flag, the Viet Cong flag was flying over the citadel. And all of a sudden, we were alerted to the fact that we were beginning to take a little bit of ground fire, and the pilot went ahead and got the aircraft to a higher altitude.
The Fire Direction Center was receiving intelligence as to where they believed the rockets and mortars were coming from. We had rockets coming right into our perimeter, landing in our gun pits. People were getting killed, shrapnel flying all over the place. Everybody's scrambling, running around. It was mass chaos, but it was controlled chaos. The kids knew what the hell they had to do. This wasn't the first time we had taken incoming. Most of the attack happened in the city and north of the city as the NVA front was trying to move in to take over the citadel and take over the city.
The status of Hue was a peaceful, serene city that was somewhat undefended because I think all parties expected that it was somewhat neutral.
The city of Hue was an extremely important place. It was not only cultural and intellectual city of all of Vietnam. It had been the imperial capital and was built after the Forbidden City in Peking. And it was indeed a fortress. Both sides had some tacit agreement that Hue was to be a neutral city. As to be expected, however, in war, things change. And the North Vietnamese decided not to honor that. And Hue was a central target for them because if they could occupy Hue, they could do a couple of things. One, they could paralyze the government. And two, they could paralyze our ability to reinforce and supply our troops that were up on the DMZ. So it was very critical strategic target. What we discovered when we went into the citadel that we were fighting heavily defended, fortified positions that were mutually supporting, which is the most difficult kind of attack that you want to have to participate in. And at that time, I was briefed on how difficult the circumstances were there and was made very aware that there was one key objective, which was the Dong Ba Gate, which was basically the high ground overlooking the battalion's zone of advance. And until that tower and that high ground had been taken, the Marines would not be able to move without having heavy fire coming down on them. So it was imperative that that position be taken. I knew that it was going to be a serious fight, but I think I had enough seasoning that I knew what was about to occur. And I had done enough to have confidence in my ability to command the company and to lead the company. But more importantly, I had confidence in them. But it goes without saying that as a commander, it's a very lonely position because you don't have anybody that you can really share your deepest thoughts, that this might be your last night on Earth. And what I remember doing, however, is that I went over to a wall and basically said a prayer. And I asked the Lord not to protect me, not to make me successful. I just asked him not to let me let down my Marines and to see us through the battle. And I gave my life up at that point because I knew that this could be the last night. And that then gave me a very peaceful feeling. And I was totally at ease, and I was totally committed to whatever was going to happen the next day. Whether I was going to be killed or wounded, I knew that one of those was going to happen. So I just went forward knowing that I've got to go as long as I can, as hard as I can, to take this objective because the battalion was counting on Delta Company to do that. Our intelligence had no idea of what was the strength in and around the tower. We just knew that there were a bunch of them up there. But it wasn't until the next morning when we moved out and I actually walked out and got my first look at the tower, but I also opened the battle by bringing a torrent of gunfire down on me. And at that point, I had to start formulating how we were going to make this attack, which became very simple because there was only one way to make the attack, and that was a frontal attack. And I was very blessed because I had a hardcore company of experienced infantrymen who had been bloodied in battles in the spring and fall of 1967. So when it came down for the crunch, I knew that they were not going to be short, and they weren't. And they went forward just like they did in 1918, out of the trench, up the hill, with no disregard to their own safety or their own security, but mission accomplishment being foremost in their mind. And through their strength, their courage, their sacrifice, we took the tower. The sense of accomplishment did not come to me personally until I was getting ready to get on the truck to leave Hawaii. And then I thought to myself, and I told the remnants of the company that were left, that I think we had really accomplished something. And I felt very proud to be part of this. As the years have passed, for whatever the reason, Hawaii has become kind of a legendary, iconic Marine Corps battle, and in many cases is mentioned along Belleau Woods, Iwo Jima, Incheon, Chosin, and Hawaii City. So I'm proud to be part of Marine Corps history.
The very first shots of the so-called Tet Offensive began at Quezon, the Marine Combat Base. Interestingly enough, the last shots of the Tet Offensive are fired there, well after it's all over around the rest of the country. There are so many North Vietnamese Army troops around that base, the fighting doesn't actually end until April. The portrayal of Tet as a disaster for the military was totally off base. It wasn't. The casualties taken by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were 15 to 20 times higher than suffered by the South Vietnamese Army, and certainly more so than the United States military forces. Yet the way it came across is, this is totally different than what we'd been told by President Johnson. The things are going just great, and you have this enormous offensive undertaken, and quite frankly, it shocked everybody. It shocked our military that they could pull it off, and it shocked the American public that things weren't nearly what the administration had been saying. So badly that by the 31st of March,
look at him.
Lyndon Johnson decides, I can't take the pressure anymore. I'm not going to run again.
Rig-funded
I shall not seek,
mafia boss.
and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
At the end of the day, Tet was a tactical victory for the South Vietnamese and for U.S. and Allied forces. But it was a strategic victory for the North Vietnamese.
He was not for the abolition of slavery
that
and
victory because of the propaganda that portrayed the Tet Offensive as being a disaster for the United States and our South Vietnamese allies.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
There's no doubt in my mind that this war could have been won before I ever got there in 1968, or my brother in 1967. If we'd gone north, it would have been over. But we now know they never intended to do that. We didn't intend to win the war. That whole issue of whether you're going to give the enemy a safe haven, a place where they can rest, recuperate, train, equip, and go back into the fight, it's a guaranteed formula for losing. We won the battles in Vietnam on the battlefield. We lost the war in the quarters of power in Washington, D.C.
Exactly.
December
and John Kerry
of
was out there
1974.
cursing the Green Berets, and Chief was telling us about it, telling them that they're doing such evil things, that they're killing innocent people. They're the ones killing the commies who were impaling young children on bayonets and killing innocent women, going down to the stream to fill up their buckets so they can do a laundry for the children. Give me a freaking break. These leftist lunatics were doing it all the time. They get us involved in these foreign engagements, and then they make us lose. These people are so crazy.
When the Congress cut off all aid to the South Vietnamese government, General Giap wrote in his own memoirs, "We knew that day we would win. We just didn't know how long it would take us." It took them until April of 1975, 4 months to win the war. With no help from the Americans, the South Vietnamese collapsed. Of course, there's bitterness on the part of those who saw that happen. For me, the greatest trauma was not what happened while I was on the battlefield. We won those fights. For me, the greatest trauma was what happened in the spring of 1975, watching those helicopters fly off the roof of our embassy and the buildings next door in Saigon. To see that as the ignominious end of what we did was incredibly painful. My guess is that most of us who suffered the consequence of that war, it really began in earnest after we saw the way it ended.
In looking back at what happened in Tet, my greatest surprise was how quick the Marines reacted as fire teams to deliver counter-battery fire upon the enemy positions. There was no, "What do I do now, Lieutenant?" Once those rockets were in, they scrambled out of the hooches, down to the gun pits, and began reacting. It was automatic.
I was a 29-year-old captain. I had been in the Marine Corps at this point for 8 years. I didn't know what combat was about, but I knew that it was part of being a Marine. And it was an acceptable part, and I accepted it as this is what you do. And I was blessed to come through unscathed. But what it did for me, it gave me a great deal of confidence in my ability to contend with almost any situation and circumstance that would be thrown my way. There's nothing that anybody can throw at me that...
That's right. Most of the soldiers that come back are stronger because they're experienced. Even though many of the times they may not agree with the war, but they're doing it out of patriotic duty and because the Army or Navy is telling them to do so. Unfortunately, a lot of these, like you said, the battles are lost in Washington and or started in Washington to enrich the super elites and the politicians. I mean, this is what's so ridiculous about this type of foreign policy. They say, you got to be a foreign policy expert. Trump is not a foreign policy expert. They start wars in Washington to get rich. This is what the bankers have always been doing.
The faces, although I can't remember all the names.
Let's get back
That
to this.
horrific experience at my young age stays with me all the time. It was brought home to me several years later when I became the casualty notification officer for the Marine Corps in the Rhode Island area, and I had to make 34 casualty calls in a 12-month period, 1 WIA, 1 MIA, 32 KIAs. The impact of what happened at Tet was brought home when I had to knock on the doors of families on Sunday afternoons. It's a leap of faith to come back. I've taken people back to the spots where they were wounded, and they'd sit and they'd look out, and they'd come back, they'd talk to their friends. And I think they come back with a closure that had been eluded them for 45 or 50 years.
I'd been here about a month and a half when we went on our first mission. The first time I'd had combat, and the first time I saw some of my brothers lying on the ground dead. Changed my life for the rest of my life.
It feels fine coming back. I came back for the first time in 1997. Then it felt sort of strange, but I had a feeling I wanted to see what was going on over here. And I've been back a number of times since over the years.
I know many Marines, anyway, who've been back several times. That in itself tells you the story. But I know many who won't come back. Their hearts are so hardened by their experience.
And the slowing down of the connection
They want
today.
nothing to do with it. As it turns out, 65 to 70% of the people in Vietnam are Buddhists. They don't look back and begrudge what happened. The only time they look back is to revere their relatives. They look forward. They embrace the American way. English is taught in all their schools. You're more welcome here than you are in parts of Europe. For me to come back once or twice a year, and I've been doing it for a long time, I look forward to it.
You ever think you'd be back here?
No, no. This was my nightmare for 25, 30 years. My worst one. All the hair, combat assaults. When we left here, we left damage. I'm glad to see Vietnam is as prosperous as it is now. I really am.
If I had to do it all over again, I would do it all over again, gladly. I think for many, many Marines, when you talk to them, they'll say the same thing. Every one of them would probably risk themselves to help me and not leave a brother behind. It's being a part of that brotherhood. Once a Marine, always a Marine.
Wow. All right, folks, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.